Good afternoon. Thank you, everyone, for being here for this important discussion about how women and girls are faring in Fairfax County, and to also help us commemorate Women's History Month. But first things first, I have a very important question for you. Please stand if you believe that pineapple belongs on pizza. Okay, now look around to see who's still sitting. And I invite you at our reception at 4 o'clock to please engage in some friendly conversation. I have very strong opinions about that, and I'm getting some vibes from the people that stood that aren't good vibes. And so, thank you all. But seriously, of course we all know that women should be celebrated every single day. And yet it is fitting to set aside time specifically to honor the gains of women and to make sure that we acknowledge the work that is still left to be done. Women's History Month gives us the opportunity to collectively do just that. And so it is my honor and privilege to be a part of this event, Gains, Gaps, Goals, the status of women and girls in Fairfax County. I am Toni Zollicoffer, the Division Director for Domestic and Sexual Violence Services in the Department of Family Services, and one of the co-leads for the Women and Girls Study Work Group. And I will be your afternoon's moderator. Before I introduce our board sponsors, a little bit of housekeeping. Bathrooms are outside of the board auditorium, down the hall to the right or left. You can't miss it. Channel 16 is recording, and so if you do not wish to be on camera or photographed, please move to the back of the auditorium and you won't be photographed there. If you have a question for the panel or for UVA, please write it down. There are index cards located at the reception table. We will be collecting those throughout the afternoon in time for the Q&A portion of the event. And then finally, the program runs from 2 to 4, and there's a reception in the atrium from 4 to 5. There is another event in the auditorium, so we will have to clear at 4 o'clock. Fairfax County leaders have been consistent advocates in the county's quest to realize equitable outcomes for all residents. Because of their commitment, we are heading in the right direction. And I'd like to take a moment to recognize our county leaders for their dedication to moving the county towards the North Star of One Fairfax. I see Deputy County Executive Chris Leonard, Family Services Director, Dr. Michael Becketts. And I think there were some others that walked through the door. Jay Cole is here. The Director of Parks and Rec. Kia Cole-Hines, Executive Director of Leadership Fairfax. Thank you all for being here. And I'd also like to recognize Carla Bruce, the Chief Equity Officer, and the other co-lead for the work group. She's under the weather today and couldn't be with us. And then finally, I'd like to recognize volunteers who have helped to make this event a success, particularly Amy Carlini and Kendra Lee. Thank you, DFS Communications. And now I'd like to introduce the board sponsors for the Women and Girls Study. Supervisor Dahlia Palchik of Providence District and Supervisor Kathy Smith of Sully District. They will come and present the Women's History Month proclamation, and Supervisor Smith will set the stage for this afternoon's event. I also invite Amber Beaker to come to the front. Thank you.
Well, welcome and good afternoon. I'm Providence Supervisor Dalia Palchik, and I'm here with my colleague Kathy Smith. We are currently the two women on the Board of Supervisors, so please join us. And we are so delighted. It's been such a pleasure to work with the Commission, such a pleasure to work with all of the women and the people who have made this a reality, and especially those who ensured that CEDAW and that the women in our community had the strength and the resources, and that we understand where we are. I just want to start by saying what I love about this research and the goals is that we need to know where we are, the good, the bad, the ugly. There's an organization I love that does a yearly failure report. I know we all love to talk about our successes, but where we really learn is where we are falling behind and where there's still work to be done. And so before I read this proclamation, just want to thank all of you who've worked on this, the researchers, and those who ensure that we really truly understand the status of women and girls, so that we can improve from that going forward. But to that, I believe we have one other of our colleagues here. I want to recognize Jimmy Bierman, our brand new supervisor from the Drainsville District as well. Is anyone else? Okay. And so I get to present this to my friend Amber. So whereas Women's History Month is an opportunity to celebrate and recognize the vital role of women who have long recognized the inherent injustice of an uneven playing field in eliminating bias and discrimination from our lives and institutions. And whereas, in alignment with the One Fairfax policy, we acknowledge that a just and inclusive society requires the collective effort of women as integral members of families, civic and community groups, businesses, legislative bodies, challenging the status quo. I love that part. And whereas, in 2024, we celebrate the example set by women dedicated to embracing everyone in our collective pursuit of freedom and opportunity, and recognize the transformative power of diverse voices in shaping a just society. And whereas women across the nation are actively engaged in developing innovative programs and projects within corporations, the military, federal agencies, and educational organizations to address and rectify injustices related to equity, diversity, and inclusion. And whereas we proudly honor the local women, past and present, advocating for change and establishing firmer safeguards, practices, and legislation reflecting the values of inclusion, equality, and fairness. Now, therefore, be it resolved that the Fairfax County Board of Supervisors, on behalf of all residents of Fairfax County, does hereby proclaim March 2024 as Women's History Month in Fairfax County and honors the courage, dedication, and contributions of women, past and present, in eliminating discrimination and promoting equality and inclusion and the pursuit of a more fair and just community. Signed by our chairman, Jeff McKay, by myself, Supervisor Dalia Palchik, by my colleague, Kathy Smith. And I think, yes, we're handing this to Amber on behalf of all women.
Thank you. On behalf of all women.
You want me to hold it?
Oh, sorry. Good morning, everyone. My name is Amber Beekler, and I serve on the Fairfax County Commission for Women in the at-large transgender women's seat appointed by Chair McKay. As is noted in the proclamation read by Supervisor Palchik, the theme for this year's Women's History Month is women who advocate for equity, diversity, and inclusion. And why is this important in Fairfax County? Fairfax County is to be celebrated as one of the most racially and ethnically diverse counties in the nation, with more than 1 in 4 residents having been born outside the U.S. and almost 40% of residents speaking a language other than English at home. The county has embraced its diversity and to a large extent has made progress to be more inclusive. However, there is work to be done to ensure equitable outcomes for women and girls, not only in Fairfax County, but across the nation and around the globe. We are positioned to be a model, a beacon for what true diversity, inclusion, and equity could look like. But it's a radical position that requires bold and courageous action. We need true allyship and solidarity with those at the margins, women of color, transgender women, and women, in general, women in LGBTQ+ communities, as they are the highest risk of violence, as are those threatened by global conflict. I would be remiss if I did not take a moment during this important commemoration to acknowledge the pain and suffering of our sisters, mothers, and daughters around the world who are caught in the middle of more global conflicts than have occurred since the end of World War II. We know that women and girls are disproportionately impacted by war and conflict simply because of their gender. Women and girls are experiencing alarming rates of sexual violence, physical and verbal abuse, and barriers in accessing resources. Given the diversity of our county, we all likely have neighbors and friends and family directly impacted. So during Women's History Month, we are compelled to not only focus on local issues, but also be mindful of the suffering of women and girls across the world. In the words of author and activist Audre Lorde, I am not free while any woman is unfree, even when her shackles are very different from my own. Closer to home, legislation across the U.S. is harming and endangering transgender women and girls and the transgender community as a whole, with over 450 anti-LGBTQ+ bills having been introduced this year already. Here in Fairfax County, we still have work to do to truly realize the diversity, equity, and inclusion ideals embodied in the One Fairfax policy. And I'll just go through a few. First, in the most recent Fairfax County Schools Youth Survey, students who identified as non-binary or LGBTQ+ suffered more physical abuse at home, bullying on school property, and attempted suicide than their non-LGBTQ+ peers. Second, in terms of access to health care, women of color in Fairfax County are more likely to live in households without a vehicle, making it harder to get to medical appointments. In addition, the county's foreign-born women and girls have higher rates of being uninsured, which makes them less likely to visit healthcare providers for wellness and preventive care. And third, research also shows that child care is not affordable for all county residents, especially not for single working mothers, and Black women make up the highest percentage of single mothers in the county. Infant care in Fairfax County can cost more than $25,000 per year. There's still much more work to be done. For the board, the Commission for Women, businesses, communities, and all of our allies and friends who care about equity. The Commission pledges to continue to work with the board and the community to bring about equity for all women and girls in Fairfax County. Thank you for taking this opportunity to bring light to this issue.
Thank you, Amber. Those were really powerful words. They really hit our hearts. You know, when I was in my 20s and I started to learn things about studies for heart attacks, and they used men. And I saw a clip on the news today that, you know, they're looking at female test dummies, right, to test safety of cars. Back in my 20s, I didn't think this was a conversation we would have to have anymore. And I'm really happy that this was brought to the board and that we have the study from UVA. And I hope that my granddaughters aren't in this same position when they grow up. So in February 2022, I introduced a board matter with Supervisor Palchik, Chairman McKay, Supervisor Gross, and Supervisor Alcorn to review the recommendations from the United Nations Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, CEDAW, and provide an analysis to the Board of Supervisors on what initiatives are in place now, what additional initiatives are on the horizon, and what additional resources may be necessary to further advance these efforts. The board also requested a resolution in support of CEDAW. In response to that board's resolution in support of CEDAW, county staff formed a multi-agency work group with representation from county departments, Fairfax County Public Schools, and the Commission for Women. This work group was charged with reviewing CEDAW recommendations in relation to the status of women and girls in Fairfax County. In their progress report, the work group recommended that the county enter into a partnership with a university to complete a more comprehensive evaluation of the status of women and girls in the county, with as much specificity as possible related to gender, race, place, age, and ethnicity. In January 2023, the work group partnered with UVA to complete the first Fairfax County Women and Girls Study, Gains, Gaps, and Goals, the status of women and girls in Fairfax County. UVA, working with Fairfax County stakeholders, conducted a data-informed, qualitative study that explored the factors related to the lives and well-being of women and girls, including economics, health, and work-life balance. I'm really bad at that one. These findings, using an intersectional gender, race, place, equity lens, will be presented today by our UVA partners. Thank you.
Thank you, Supervisor Palchik and Supervisor Smith, and for setting that stage. It's been a year more since we have been in partnership with University of Virginia, and the work group studied making this, and this study is unique in a couple of different ways. I think the first thing that makes it unique is that it really provides insights about how women and girls of different identities and in different parts of the county are faring. And it also serves as a model for how to give a specific analysis of particular residents and how they are doing. And so we are very, very excited to present this study. On page 23, there's a list of contributors to this effort. It's a long list of contributors, but I want to just take a moment to recognize especially the women and girls who provided insights through the community conversations, and 2 DSVS staff members who took their time outside of work to translate the questions for the community conversations. They're not here, but Ana Hernandez and Sujin Kim translated for the community conversations, and so I want to acknowledge them specifically. And so now I want to introduce our UVA partners, Stephanie Shipp and Joanna Schroeder from UVA's Social and Decision Analytics Division in the Biocomplexity Institute. That is a lot. Stephanie Shipp is the university research professor and the lead researcher for the Women and Girls Study, and Joanna Schroeder is a University of Virginia research specialist. She is completing her master's degree in library and information science at Drexel University. After their presentation, we will have a panel discussion related to the key findings. And so please jot down any questions that you might have for either UVA or for our panelists. We will collect them for the Q&A portion of the program. And now I invite UVA to present their findings. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Tony, for that warm welcome. And thank you for inviting us to conduct this study. It was a world-changing, an emotional-changing kind of a study for us to do because it was also so personal. I lived and worked in Fairfax County for 26 years. My girls were raised in Fairfax County, so I can see both the benefits and where those benefits may not be participated by all across the county in the same way. So it was a privilege to work on the study for two reasons. One was our interactions with women and girls across the county through community conversations, through the Commission for Women, through diverse women in South County and women just across the county, and we heard their stories. That provided a whole new lens into the data analysis that we did. That was actually the second part of the study after we had done the data analysis and informed our questions. But without that, I don't think this study would have been what it was. That was such a critical part of our work. So these community conversations should be always a part of future studies going forward. The other was working with the formidable co-leads of this project. Tony Zollicoffer, Carla Bruce, and Michelle Gregory. They were amazing. I mean, their passion and commitment and dedication to this work were just awesome to watch and just created the energy and enthusiasm for the whole group going forward. And then finally, the Fairfax CEDAW Working Group, who were so generous in providing all their earlier research and their data discovery and the work that they had done, provided a huge start to what we did and allowed us to accomplish more. So, with that, we did have a very collaborative approach to this work. We've talked about, we met with a variety of women across the county. We leveraged all the county's work, the Fairfax County Strategic Plan and the One Fairfax Equity Plan, the Health Needs Assessment, and then finally, as I already mentioned, all the research of the Fairfax Working Group, the CEDAW Working Group. So it was the hardest part of any project is actually identifying those questions that you want to address. And we first started doing that by reviewing all the county documents, having discussions with the Fairfax Working Group and our co-leads, but then doing a deep literature review. And we identified 25 issues. That then led to another round of several discussions about what was most important, what did we need to cover in that first study. And then from that, after identifying those questions, which Joanna, who's the true lead on this study, who conducted most of the data analysis and visualization, we were able to present these exploratory analysis and these maps with visualization that told the story of women and girls across Fairfax County. So this collaborative approach is foundational to our work. We have a scientific process that we created in large part through our work with Fairfax County over the last 10 years that we call community learning through data-driven discovery. The key innovation here is that the community, or in this case, our local government, our leads and our Fairfax Working Group, they participate by asking and answering the questions. So it's not just researchers going off and doing this work. At every step of the way, we are interacting and seeking feedback from them and what their analysis is or what their take is on the data as well. That was critical, again, to making this report what it was. The other aspect or innovation in this process is just the continuous interaction and communication, and so that's what this outer wheel is portraying. And then the middle wheel is looking at the data learning aspects of what we do. And data learning at each stage of the way, it informs our prior steps and our subsequent steps. So it's iterative, and that's why it's a circle. And then at the heart of this process is our data science framework. It's our rigorous and repeatable and iterative process in which we go back and forth. But as I've already mentioned, probably the hardest part is the first step, that problem identification. So we identified, naturally, the big question is, what is the status of women and girls in Fairfax County? But when you think about it, that's a really broad question. How do we narrow that down? How do we make this meaningful and practical and applicable or actionable? And so Joanna's going to walk through. It was already described that we looked at economic indicators. What are the economic indicators? What are the health indicators? And what are the work-life balance indicators? There are many others you could do, and subsequent studies might go deeper or might take on new topics. But what's really important about our data science framework is that each stage of the each part or each step of the framework is that we look at everything we're doing with an ethical lens to question, is there implicit bias in the data? You know, will these results provide a vulnerable group, unfair advantage? And so you're always trying to look at these data and your questions and what you're doing, your analysis, from the viewpoint of an ethical lens to ensure that what you're doing is right and it's on the course in the intention of what that study is all about. So I want to turn this over to Joanna, who's going to present the indicators, and then I will come back up and talk about the policy recommendations that emerged from this data analysis. And thank you again for inviting us to do this.
Awesome. So I want to talk about two things before we get into the indicators, which are intersectionality and geography, which we already sort of heard about these innovations and why it was so critical to really take these things into account when we were conducting this study. So I wanted to first frame our discussion of intersectionality around language from the One Fairfax policy, which describes that all residents deserve an equal chance to succeed. It requires the county and schools to consider equity in decision-making in future policies, programs, and services, as well as compels the county and schools to look intentionally, comprehensively, and systematically at barriers that may be creating gaps in opportunity. And so we can kind of take this language, right, and frame our discussion around intersectionality in our report. So we used an intersectional lens, as was mentioned earlier. And intersectionality is a theoretical framework that describes how intersecting identities of individuals and groups produce interdependent experiences of discrimination. So in our case, we most often use the race, place, gender equity lens to look at measures, but we did include information wherever possible on other intersectional identities like language spoken at home or immigration status. There are just a bunch in the report, but since this was already brought up, I'll just also give a shout out to one of the ways we can do better, which is the data collection on some of those identities is just so sparse. So although we know that there are just so many different identities, right, that produce those interdependent experiences of discrimination, the way in which we can really complete those meaningful local analyses is really encumbered by that data availability. And the final thing about the intersectionality that is so important is it helps us to identify those vulnerable populations and arrive at those meaningful insights. And going along with that also is the geography aspect. We also already heard about how large of a county Fairfax is and how many different types of experiences exist within this county. And so one of the ways we can drill down on those experiences is through looking at indicators at a sub-county level. So in the report, we include several different sub-county geographies, most of which are shown here. Those include public use microdata areas, also known as PUMAs, high school pyramids, census tracts, and supervisor districts to kind of operationalize that into a relevant policy making frame. And this graphic just shows a little bit about how it's kind of tricky to crosswalk between those things, right? So again, it's a data availability question. Which geographies are these data actually available in? And how do we transform it? How do we crosswalk it to arrive at those meaningful insights? So the report explains a lot more about all of this in detail. Today, we'll just be giving a high-level overview of some of these things, but feel free to, keep this in your mind and ask questions if you want in the panel, or, look at the report and ask me questions afterwards. This has already been said many times, but I'll just say it one more time. We looked at many different types of indicators. The ones we'll be talking about today are within economics, health, and work-life balance. So the report goes into the economic indicators of the wage gap, women-owned businesses, poverty, the household living budget, and employment. And these ones in bold all present a few of the high-level findings from right now. So to just tell you a little bit more about the key takeaways of the economic indicators overall, we find that the wage gap persists in Fairfax County despite women's gains in education, which comes from the literature. We know that over time, over decades, there has been a narrowing of the wage gap, but we do find that it still exists in Fairfax County. We find that female heads of households are more likely to be economically vulnerable than their male counterparts. And I'll give you a little bit more context for that phrase, economically vulnerable, later in the presentation. but we find that 28% of households overall in the county are economically vulnerable, according to an index that takes into account local cost of living and family composition. And importantly, 44% of those households have children younger than 18, indicating that this is a family issue. We find that in the public schools, girls of color are more likely than boys and white girls to work over 3 hours on an average school day. And as we've mentioned before, I want to just continuously bring it back to our community conversations insights because they were so helpful in just bringing the data to life for us and really telling the story. And from those conversations, we learned, we saw it in the data and we heard it again. It is expensive to live in Fairfax County and even more so to raise a family. And that often requires long work hours, which we'll talk more about in the work-life balance section. We also heard that women are community champions. We heard it and we saw it, that women in Fairfax show up for their communities, and they're really dedicated to volunteering and uplifting others in the county. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the wage gap. As I mentioned, we find that the wage gap persists in Fairfax County. And to give you a quick definition, the wage gap is commonly understood to be the difference in pay between men and women. And so this figure we're looking at shows the difference in pay between white men and women of different races and ethnicities. And you can see on average, white men in Fairfax make $41 per hour, and the average wages for women range from $13 to $29 per hour. So the median hourly wages for women are lower than those for white men in Fairfax County. One commonly understood aspect that causes the wage gap is occupational segregation. So the idea that men and women commonly work in different occupations, right? So we find that in Fairfax, that is partially the case. Women are less likely to be working in higher paying occupations and less likely to be earning wages in the top 50th percentile. But we also find that even within occupations, there exists a wage gap. So this is kind of a multifaceted issue with a lot of things contributing to it. One being occupational segregation, and on the other hand, also being some systemic discrimination against women. We find also that the wage gap widens as women get older, especially in salaried positions. And that is also spoken about in the research, in the literature, I should say. And finally, the literature also points to, and we find in our study, that women of color experience larger wage gaps in Fairfax County than white women and Asian women. Next, I want to talk about teen employment in Fairfax County. So, as I mentioned, we found that teen girls in the public schools in Fairfax are more likely than teen boys to report working 3 hours or more on an average school day. And more so, girls of color specifically are more likely to report working 3 hours or more on an average school day than white girls. And this was something we were really curious about and we wanted to learn more about in our community conversations. And I think that we only had one group of teen girls that we were able to speak to. But for me, that conversation really illuminated, I think it would be so interesting to look more into this indicator too. But for me as well, I think it illuminated the ideas about support for teen girls overall. What are the opportunities for teen girls to do after school? What are the opportunities for them to explore different careers, different extracurricular activities in that way? I think that was what kind of stood out for me when we were investigating this indicator. So the final economic indicator I'll talk about is the household living budget, which considers local and family context when we're looking at economic vulnerability. So the household living budget is the amount of income necessary to meet a household's need to function at a modest yet adequate standard of living. And so we take components for this budget of housing, food, transportation, childcare, health insurance, broadband, other necessities, and federal and state taxes. And so that piece of economically vulnerable households are those whose income does not cover the household living budget for their specific family composition in their specific census tract. So this is a hyper-local cost of living and sensitive to those different family combinations, whether you have preschoolers, young infants, high schoolers, that kind of thing is taken into account with the household living budget. And so juxtaposed to a measure like poverty, which is decided at the federal level, and of course we can do some local adjustments to that, household living budget is much more tailored to the actual local context. And we find that in Fairfax County, the household living budget is greater than the official poverty threshold for all family types. And also in Fairfax County, we know, experientially all of us know, right, that the cost of living is significantly higher, and that's borne out in the data as well. So we find that 1 out of every 3 married couples with children in Fairfax are economically vulnerable, compared to 17% of married couples without children, signifying again that this is a family issue and that childcare is a great expense in Fairfax County. For female-headed households, 2 out of every 3 single-parent households are economically vulnerable, which compare that to 43% for male-headed single-parent households. And finally, we just wanted to drive home that we can backtrack out of the household living budget a living wage out of census tract for different household types. And we wanted to call out this idea of a living wage not just benefiting workers, but also benefiting businesses and society, which we'll speak to a little bit more in the policy recommendations, but was a definite theme throughout this research, how from multiple angles, right, people, policy, and businesses, we really need to take a multi-pronged approach to tackling these multifaceted issues that affect women and girls. So to preview the health indicators for you, we looked at healthcare availability, specifically the availability of OBGYNs and pediatricians in the county, measures around preventive health for women, chronic health condition prevalence, and life expectancy. And I'll just be going over the key takeaways for the health indicators. We find that economically vulnerable women have higher rates of some chronic health conditions like poor mental health and arthritis compared to men. And in addition, we find that many women don't obtain preventive care. It's a challenge for them to obtain that. Women ages 18 to 64 and foreign-born women are the most likely to be uninsured in the county. And we also find that women generally have a longer life expectancy than men, which mirrors a national trend. But we also have to take that into consideration when we think about overall life expectancy trends, which are not trending upwards at the moment. And to speak to the community conversations again, which brought out a lot of what we were seeing in the data and sort of colored it in new ways, we found that many women expressed mental health concerns like isolation and feelings of depression when we spoke to them. Especially women with families from other countries expressed a great concern for their family's well-being and, having less ability to go and visit relatives, and in addition at home, having less caregiving support. Finally, we saw in the community conversations that women noted that not having access to a car made many household tasks, including keeping up with medical appointments, much more difficult, signifying again how this, health is a multifaceted issue that takes into account, your economic status and what sort of resources you have available to you, like a vehicle or perhaps, living in an area with better public transit access. And finally, I'll discuss the work-life balance indicators, which were weekly hours worked, intergenerational family households, single parenthood, and child care cost. So the key takeaways for these indicators, we found that in Fairfax County, employers, which include businesses, government, and nonprofits, play a key role in supporting women and mothers, which I mentioned a little bit earlier. This sort of came throughout all of the indicator sections, that this really requires a multi-pronged approach and buy-in from several different stakeholder groups. We find that childcare represents a large percentage of income for women and families. It's not on this slide, but Fairfax County is in the top 1% of counties in the nation for childcare cost. And that ranges in the percentage of income ranges from 8% to 14% on average for childcare for infants and toddlers. But another thing that came out of our discussions with the county that I didn't really know much about at all was about the cost of childcare for the childcare providers. And actually that cost of childcare is an underestimate. The childcare providers are artificially deflating their costs, and also the county receives subsidies to subsidize childcare, right? So I think that indicator for me really drove home this idea of just the multifaceted nature of these issues that the childcare industry represents, and Stephanie will present a little bit more about that in the policy takeaways as well. Finally, we found that Asian and Hispanic women are more likely to live in multi-generational households. And from the community conversations, we learned that living in a multi-generational household is often a great benefit, not just for child care support, but to access that built-in support network. Other insights from the community conversations included the importance of support and resources, like quality childcare and teen activities, which can improve work-life balance for women. Maybe it was just me being short-sighted, but I didn't really expect to hear women say over and over again that the best thing we could do to support their work-life balance was provide activities for their teens and children. But I think it just really drove home again for me the idea of the family unit and how critical thinking in terms of families is when we talk about these issues, and more importantly, when we talk about solving these issues. Working long hours also is often necessary because of financial constraints, right? Women mentioned that. But at the same time, many women mentioned working long hours for career fulfillment. And I'll talk more about working long hours on the next slide, but I think this was another area that I would be really interested to dig into more, because it seems that there's kind of a lot going on in that working long hours measure. So finally, the last insight from the community conversations I'll talk about pertaining to work-life balance is that women stated that caregiving and managing a home were not valued or appreciated in the same way as working for wages. So I think that that's something that we see a lot culturally, and it did bubble up in those community conversations as well. So in terms of working long hours, in the data analysis portion of the study, we operationalized that as working over 50 hours per week, which in the literature is associated with many negative health outcomes specifically. So we felt like that was an appropriate benchmark to see how many women and who were those women who were working over 50 hours per week. And we found that 8% of women in the county report working over 50 hours per week. And they're most commonly in those prime working years of 26 to 65. And this graph shows it's the 26 to 65 age range for different ethnicities and races, and just the different hours they work, not just over 50. That's the number that's highlighted there. And so, like I mentioned, we really wanted to understand more about why women might be working over 50 hours per week. Is it because they really love their job, they like doing it, and are happy to work long hours, or is it because of economic necessity? And on top of that, might they be working more than one job, which kind of adds, obviously, to all the commuting and all that other stuff that goes into working that takes up your time. So we found that women who work over 50 hours per week make higher wages than women who work less than 50 hours per week. So they make $31 per hour, and women who work less than 50 hours per week make $8 less than that. 15% of women who work over 50 hours per week are single mothers, and 10% live in the Hunter Mill and Drainesville supervisor districts. But I wanted to mention that we weren't really satisfied with the way that we could slice and dice this data specifically. So there's just not complete information about multiple job holders and other ways that we really wanted to drill down on this measure. And so I think that also kind of came up for us as an opportunity for future data collection. And in the community conversations, we found that women expressed that they were often working long hours due to that high cost of living in the county. And some women also mentioned that they did work multiple jobs just to support their family. And now Stephanie will finish up with the policy recommendations.
Are we good? Amy, are we good on time? Okay, great. So I think you heard a lot of policy recommendations emerging from Joanna's presentation. So we'll just run through this list that we worked hard as the whole group worked on. And a lot of them are meant to test ideas and learn before policies are put in place, but that's always the first step toward any new policy recommendations and programs. The first is what can be advocated for or proposed at federal and state levels. So, for example, the Child Independent Care Credit, $6,000 if you have 2 children, whether you live in Fairfax County, Virginia, or whether you live in Ames, Iowa. Maybe that is a place where the household living budget could be applied or where it would be adjusted for cost of living. In any case, it needs to be increased, at least for metropolitan areas. We propose conducting a pilot. Many areas have done that, so there's work that can be looked at for what would a living wage look like? What would it actually cost? What are the benefits? Do the benefits outweigh the cost? And trying to look not just beyond hardcore numbers, but what are some of the spillover effects, some of those things that you can't measure that you might hear through community conversations. And finally, just implementing other policies to benefit women and girls, always having that at the forefront. Another, because childcare was so pervasive in what we learned through the data and through the community conversations, was how do we professionalize this as an occupation? And one thought, thinking about what they do in other countries, is to make it part of our educational system. And so these childcare workers are teachers. They're teaching our young children. And so how do we incorporate them either as part of the educational system or at least treat them in parallel with the same pay and the same benefits that currently teachers receive, which is not necessarily always in Fairfax County. I mean, teachers are still notoriously perhaps underpaid, but that's another whole thing that we didn't look at all. So now I'm digressing, and I shouldn't do that. And then to expand eligibility subsidies. We know that eligibility is still well over $100,000 of income, but in Fairfax County, that's simply not enough. That income threshold needs to be increased where people receive subsidies for obtaining child care, especially in the after-school programs, but across even the summer programs, which can be expensive, even though already subsidized by the county. But these are straightforward things. And then at the same time, many women are taking care of parents and relatives or the family members with disabilities. And it's a parallel track. Those workers in those professions are also underpaid. And so how do we make them how do we professionalize their occupations and increase their pay and their benefits as well as making it affordable for families to afford that care as well. And many women, they have older parents and they have young children, and so they have childcare costs and they have these elder parent costs as well, or older parent costs as well. We also heard that many women and girls really don't know about the resources and benefits available to them. So how do we enhance education and outreach to just let people know these benefits are available, we'll help you through them, or figure out how to apply for them. And then we heard a lot, and we actually heard it and saw it. The girls at the community center that we had our community conversations with, the women at the community centers that they were part of an opportunity neighborhood and working together. You could tell they were thriving because they had this collaboration with other women, ability to talk, ability to meet, ability to work on projects together. But we need more of that, and we heard that. And sometimes it can just maybe be a room where women can get together to have coffee. And sometimes it can be more elaborate as well. So sometimes the solutions can be simple, and then sometimes more broad-based, and one can grow out of the other as well. We heard a lot about parental and family leave guidelines across sectors, so we recommend that those be evaluated and see if they could be perhaps standardized in some way, but improved upon as well. And then there's two more, but a really important one was that in the One Fairfax equity policy, Joanna pointed out the language, which was quite inclusive and really directed the county to look at equity as a primary driver of policy. But in the strategic plan, I think it's implicitly there, but there's no explicit mention of women and girls in the strategic plan. So we would recommend that be incorporated. And then importantly, as part of that would be to establish a gender-specific baseline and to integrate those strategies into the strategic plan. So really being explicit about it. And then Joanna talked about this as well when we looked at work-life balance, but advocating for new data discovery and exploration. For example, there are no data at the federal level or at the local level that talk about multiple multiple job holders. So we may know that women work over 50 hours. We saw that it was primarily in the professional ranks, but we really couldn't tell if other women were working more than 50 hours because they were holding multiple jobs or one job. It's a different scenario when you look at those two, and so we need data on that. But also more available health data that is often available in aggregate at the local level, or just to look. We have been constantly amazed as we work with counties and cities and towns, how much local data can inform your decision making. And so how do we make that more available and easily accessible by analysts at all levels, including the county? So going back and wrapping up, our community learning through data-driven discovery process advocates building data capacity to use data insights in your decision making. And some of these policy recommendations head you in that direction. Part of the report also has a whole list of data recommendations that we recommend the county undertake to also enhance their policy making. So we encourage you to look at that, and we're always available to answer questions as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, UVA. We're going to transition to our panel. But I do want to do a couple of acknowledgments that I wasn't here before. Michelle Gregory and Data Analytics County did amazing work in helping us with this and co-leading this effort. So, Michelle, can you just raise your hand? Thank you. Chloe's back there as well. And so we're now going to invite our panel up, and as they're coming to the back here, and UVA, please come up. We're going to transition to our panel discussion. We have a couple of runners who will be collecting your questions, and so please take a moment to ask any questions that you would like the panel or UVA to answer for you, and we will do that a part of the question and answer section. So let's give our panelists a hand as they're coming forward. Mic on. Amy Carlini gave us that lesson, and I failed. So I'm going to introduce our panelists and then have an opportunity for them to answer a framing question. And so I'm going from the right all the way to the left. Our first panelist is Melanie Aquile, who is the founder and CEO of Minwoo, an economic development tech company that enables culturally informed business development through their AI-powered ecosystem management platform. Welcome, Melanie.
Hello, everyone.
Salima Hamani, who is the founder and CEO of SZH Consulting, a management consulting firm specializing in the science and art of organizational development and leadership effectiveness. Welcome, Salima. Hi, Jamie. Jamie Hirschfeld is the Director of Client Sales and Services at Flex Professionals, a staffing and recruiting firm that champions part-time, remote work, and career breaks while showcasing the value of diverse talent to employers. Thank you for coming. Next, we have Hunter Gunn, LCSW. Hunter is the Senior Director of Community Health with Inova Health Systems, overseeing the Inova Cares for Women and Children programs. Welcome, Hunter. Thank you for coming. Monica Jackson. Hi, Ms. Jackson. Ms. Jackson is an experienced advocate for women and girls in Fairfax County, an active advisory board member of the Fairfax Child Care Council and the Virginia Small Business Council. Thank you, Ms. Jackson, for being here. And last but absolutely not least, we have Rita Kareem. Rita serves as the student board member of the Fairfax County School Board, representing over 180,000 students. Give it up for Rita. And so I'm just going to ask each of the panel participants a question to get us started, and then we will have some questions from the audience. So Melanie, as the founder and CEO of a company providing culturally informed business development support, what are you seeing in the area for women and girls?
Sure. First of all, thank you all for being here. Thank you for having me. It's a bit serendipitous, having been born and raised in Fairfax County. I went to White Oaks Elementary School. I went to Lake Braddock Secondary School. So very excited to be here to discuss something that's very near and dear to my heart. Now, when I think about culturally informed, what that means is essentially looking at a personalized view of one's lived experience, right? So whether it's in technology, whether it's in business, being able to take in all the outside factors that individual comes with is how you can better support them, education, business, technology, et cetera. I think about my own personal journey, having gone through the education system here, finding my way to an engineering school. It wasn't until I got to Georgia Tech that I realized I knew nothing about engineering, despite having showed inclination toward engineering as a young child. I was always taking apart things, putting them back together. Connects were my favorite toy. But there was no real investment or exploration when it came to more technical subjects in that way. And so I think back about, the experience that I had in hearing, the study and some of the findings, and it's really encouraging to see that there's, such an intense focus on making sure that our women and our girls are brought to the forefront in these ways. Specifically, if you think about technology, one of the highest paying wages that you can have here in the United States, if we think about closing the wage gap, we're thinking about how do we bring women and girls into the technology space. And so a lot of the work that I've done has been to advocate, to show within technology, I think what I've found when it comes to women and girls, there's generally a one route or a singular route that's emphasized when it comes to what it means to be in technology. Generally, people think about hands-on keyboard, you're coding, you're debugging, but there are so many auxiliary roles within the technology field that for me, when I discovered you can be a project manager, or you can be a product manager, or you can be a designer, there are so many other roles that lend toward the interests and the skill sets that I think come naturally to women and girls. We've seen a lot more communication and a lot more exploration around that, and so for me that's really encouraging.
Thank you, Melanie. Mm-hmm. And Salima, as a business owner and in organizational development, talk about economic opportunities that you see when it comes to women and girls.
Yeah, thank you so much, Tony, for the question. And I echo Melanie. I'm really excited to be here. I'm an immigrant to this country, and I'm an immigrant to Fairfax County. I've lived here for over 25 years now, and it's really special to be here and part of this really insightful and really important session. So at SZH Consulting, we focus on providing advisory services to organizations around improving organizational health, which is really around improving performance and impact. And so what I really found interesting about this study, what was really highlighted, is the disparity that exists for women and girls in the county, especially when it comes to equitable pay, access to career building and high-paying jobs, as well as to leadership positions. And then when you think about this, is all amplified when you consider women of color or those of us who are from a minority demographic. This finding becomes really critical, because what I've found firsthand in my work with organizations that, and these are organizations of all types, all sizes, that when women are equally represented in companies and in communities in terms of pay, power, and influence, those organizations, they make better decisions, and thereby they perform better and are more financially, they have better financial results. The other work that we've been doing a lot with our clients recently is around the future of work and the skills that are going to be really critical in the new era of automation and artificial intelligence. And what we're finding is that the skills that are going to be truly irreplaceable when it comes to administrative jobs, when it comes to office jobs, when it comes to even senior leadership positions, are skills that are typically termed as softer skills. And these are skills around empathy and communications and negotiation and community building. And these are all skills that women excel at and they bring to the workplace. So for me, if as a result of these findings, as the researchers have recommended, if more resources can be allocated towards the economic upliftment of women and girls, whether it be more access to or easier access to vocational, technical, leadership training, right, as well as addressing some of the key hurdles that all or majority of the women in the county face. So one of the things that we've heard about is the high cost of childcare, right? As well as implementation of policies and guidelines that will create more equitable environment, economic environment, right? Access to more equity in terms of pay, job opportunities for women and girls that will create more economic opportunities for younger girls in the future, and I think it will uplift the economic strength of the county as a whole. The other thing that I found really interesting in this report was there was a line item in the report that said that there wasn't any considerable or significant pattern of women-owned businesses in the county. And as someone who owns a successful and growing business, I can tell you firsthand the very positive impact that such businesses like mine can have in the community. But it is also true that many women entrepreneurs, especially minority women entrepreneurs, still face a lot of hurdles when it comes to finding sources of robust funding, when it comes to finding resources, right, that allow you to do, high quality resources for business development. And when it comes to finding networks where you can build those really critical business relationships and that can open doors, those things continue to be very challenging for women entrepreneurs. So I would like to see an economic environment in which business owners like me or girls and women who want to pursue entrepreneurial paths are not only encouraged, but they're supported and sponsored. Imagine the possibilities if Fairfax County becomes an entrepreneurial hub for women, right? I very much believe that such a vision could really help address many of the issues and challenges that the girls and women face today, which are highlighted in the report. And it's going to create a much better economic environment for all future generations.
Thank you, Salima. And Jamie, what do you think are some of those challenges and opportunities, particularly with persons who are re-entering the workforce or who need to take career breaks? Talk a little bit about what you see those opportunities and challenges from your perspective.
Thanks, Tony, and hello, everyone, and thank you all, as others have said, for the privilege of joining this important conversation on building a stronger, more inclusive community for women and girls, both in Fairfax County and beyond. I am looking at this through a little different lens, and as Joanna mentioned, it's really important that we get the employer perspective and get them on board. So as we celebrate Women's History Month, and we kicked it off really well with that proclamation earlier, it's super crucial that we underscore the pivotal role of workplace flexibility and how that can narrow the gender wage gap and ensure women's sustained participation in the workforce. But I feel, as others before me have said, before I really dive into the heart of the discussion, that I want to share why this topic resonates so deeply with me. And as Joanna and Stephanie both said, I'm a working mother. I have an aging parent. And then obviously I'm, a member of Flex Professionals, and many people often ask me if I'm a founder or a partner of Flex Professionals, and I often wish I were, although some days I might not feel that way, but my connection really to this cause runs very parallel. As many of you might not know, the mission of Flex Professionals is to destigmatize part-time remote work and career breaks while showcasing the value of a really diverse talent pool. And this is really personal to me. I was fortunate enough, many would say privileged, to navigate caregiving for my two boys who are now, believe it or not, 15 and 17, while remaining in the workforce. And that was really thanks to a really great employer. Believe it or not, almost 2 decades ago, he allowed me to work remotely, and his decision really shaped my journey. And without him, I might have had a totally different story, and my career path might have taken a different turn. So as we look at the insights from the study, the evolution of Flex Professionals over the past 15 years, we can't forget the lessons from the pandemic. And I also think it's important to look at the groundbreaking research of the Nobel laureate Claudia Goldin. Really a stark reality emerges, and that is that the absence of workplace flexibility poses a significant barrier to women's advancement and their ability to return to work at parity in pay and responsibility levels. You talked about earlier in terms of parity in pay, and I think that career gap and lack of flexibility is one of the reasons behind that. I think employers without a flexible workplace will be significantly disadvantaged in accessing a critical talent segment, and that's women. My son had said I say flexible too often, and I think there's a reason for that, because I think it's important we need to remember that. Women today represent nearly 60% of college graduates, and they're a rising number in our workforce. In fact, at this point, women between the ages of 25 and 54 make up almost 80, are at a participation rate of almost 80%. And as Joanna pointed out, though, there's still a huge wage gap, about 18% wage gap at this point, and it's even higher in Fairfax County and even higher as people get older. And again, I think some of that is because of the career gaps, and that's really underscored by Goldin's research, which says that there's a critical need to address these career gaps And many of that's driven by career responsibilities. You mentioned earlier, no one really talks about that, and there's caregiving responsibilities on both ends, whether it's for children or parents or both. And that's really hindering their career progression and their pay. So flexible work options such as remote work, adaptable schedules, and pathways to returning to the workforce is really a powerful tool in mitigating these challenges. And that's where Flex Professionals often comes in. We play a huge role in addressing these obstacles. We're based here in Fairfax County. We work across the DMV, and we work with local businesses on the significance of workplace flexibility and how they can integrate workplace flexibility into their culture. And yes, Supervisor Smith, I don't know where you are, we can have a work-life balance. And so this shift towards embracing flexibility was actually a positive outcome of the pandemic. Believe it or not, there was a positive outcome. I'm sure you all know many companies moved towards more flexible work arrangements, and this was huge for more women entering the workforce and narrowing the gender wage gap. But as we've now seen, more and more companies are having regressive trends and promoting a return to office settings. And this undermines all the work we've done with gender equity, and it's just exacerbating the talent shortages. We've seen polls where 2/3 of remote workers would consider leaving their jobs if they're required to return to the office 5 days a week. And those that have individual caregiving responsibilities, again, either children or parents or both, are 1.5 more times likely to leave the workforce than those are non-caregivers if they're asked to return to the office. And this trend is really mirrored in our candidate pool, who are about 90% women. We're seeing more and more people becoming candidates because of these return to the office mandates. So again, this is highlighting the need for organizations to look at workplace flexibility and put that into their operations. And we know that women do not have to leave the workforce because of lack of flexibility. Organizations who have flexibility are able to retain their workers. A recent study found that when companies switched positions from fully in-person to fully remote, they were able to hire 6% more women. So it is possible, and employers need to think about that. So as we move forward and reaffirm our commitment to workplace flexibility, sorry, I did say it a lot, my son was right, it is a way to have gender equity and talent retention. So I ask you all out there to work together and look at how we can have a more sustainable workforce for generations to come by looking at workplace flexibility.
Thank you, Jamie. Thank you for being flexible. So we're going to switch gears just a little bit, and we're going to talk about health and health indicators. Hunter, I know that you've read the study and you've read some of the health indicators that came out of the study. Can you talk a little bit about what you are seeing in your work on the ground as it relates to the health and wellness of women and children?
Sure, absolutely. Thank you, everyone, for having me. I echo. I'm excited to be a part of this conversation. I think that what stands out at the very beginning was how much of what we are seeing in the study is actually exactly mirrored in what we are seeing in our clinics every day. And I do need to start by saying that the population specifically that I serve, that the Inova Cares clinics serve, is the under and uninsured. We are looking to break that sort of access barrier, that disparity in care. And so we're seeing patients who are ineligible for Medicaid and need financial assistance, or are Medicaid patients specifically, which does sort of color the lens a little bit in terms of what I see specifically. But I think we know that there's disparity in services across the spectrum for women and girls, and healthcare is just one more of those. And I can think of a number of opportunities for growth and opportunity in that realm. But one in particular that is standing out to me is the increase in mental health needs. The impact of the pandemic was, frankly, far-reaching, and we were ill-prepared. I can't think of a better way to say that. We just weren't prepared for the long-term impact that it was going to bring. And so There's, of course, the increase in chronic health issues and in general healthcare needs, but there was also a significant increase in mental health concerns and a decrease in coping skills, which is making it more difficult to provide standard care. As a higher percentage of women and girls are primarily in the home, they were more impacted. There's a higher level of responsibility to care for families without resources to do so. There was a higher level of isolation. And what it led to is what we're seeing is an increase in depression, anxiety, and general mental health disorders that we're having to address. And I'd be remiss if I didn't include the vast research that has always been linking stress and poor well-being with negative health outcomes. A second opportunity is related to identifying ways to increase the preventive care. We continue to see in lower income households that there is a lack of preventative care. And with women in particular, there's also still a trend and a mindset of others before self. I think it's remiss to not talk about that. Women and girls are the first ones to be like, oh, I'm gonna make sure I take care of somebody else before I take care of myself. Oh, my leg has fallen off, I'll just deal with that later, I've gotta make dinner, or whatever it is, you know? And so, I think since they're less likely to seek that preventative care due to these other responsibilities and the access issues, that they're more commonly experiencing the underlying undiagnosed conditions that impact their general health and wellness, as well as a decreased ability to recover from those more complicated health issues. Another area is family planning and reproductive health. And I really debated about whether or not I was going to bring this up for the obvious reasons of the challenging conversation with the political landscape and the legal side of it, but it is a health and welfare issue, and it directly impacts our women. So I felt like I had to just go for it. So you can exhale, Tony. I'm not going to make it awkward. I'm not going to make it awkward, but I will say, without delving into a conversation about women's rights and entities, which I feel strongly about in my way, and solely focusing on the health and welfare perspective, I would say of what is currently legal to access in Virginia, we just need more. Like, we need more access to services. We need more access to affordable care. And we definitely need more readily available information and unbiased education in that form. There's so much misinformation floating around regarding what is and what isn't and what they can and what they can't. I think that that's an area where we're doing a disservice to women. And I won't say anything else about that. So I think given, thank you. Yeah. So I think given the increase in other life challenges, transportation, jobs and finance, housing, mental health, domestic violence, that's not even the beginning of the list, right? The physical health issues have fallen down the priority ladder. And it's harder to treat medically when there are so many other concerns for women and girls that need to be addressed first. So to do this is going to require training of the healthcare profession as a whole and increased awareness of the community of a whole. We all need to be aware of what is out there and what isn't and where the resources are, and a focus on identifying and growing those types of resources that will benefit these families. So, ever the pessimist, I do tend to focus on the gaps and the goals as opposed to the gains. But I think in full transparency to what the study looked at, and there is some bright spots, there are some things that are going well in the healthcare world, and I think it's important to not overlook those. And so I will say in 2021, when Virginia Medicaid expanded to increase Virginia Medicaid for women regardless of status during the pre and postnatal period, was a game changer. I can't remember being as happy as I was the day that happened because, right? Because even though Inova Cares was already providing charitable care and access to prenatal care with or without insurance, there were suddenly the doors opened and you could get so many other services. Oh, you need a chiropractor, you need an allergist, you need a podiatrist. Okay, let's get you connected. And so there was a whole window of time where women could finally get services, even though it was only for a window, that they couldn't get before. And then for all of those agencies who weren't equipped to be able to provide charity-based care, this allowed them to open their doors to provide access to a population in need, which increased access. So again, I think that was fabulous, and it demonstrated that we are starting to pay attention specifically to the needs of the women in our community. There's been an expansion in service areas for women's care, making access easier, which is new sites, hiring more providers, and engaging more support services. So I think that's on the uptrend. And finally, there's a priority being placed, and this is near and dear to my heart, a more diverse healthcare workforce to ensure that the needs of, and we've talked a lot about women and women of color and things like that everyone sees themselves in the care that they're receiving, is able to build that trust. And so I think that that's another area. So while work's still to be done, I do see some areas of hope that allow me to think that some of these disparities in care are being addressed. So thank you.
Thank you. So, Ms. Jackson, a lot of the study talked about childcare and the affordability of childcare. And we also sometimes forget that childcare providers as business owners is an important conversation to have when we talk about the childcare issue. Can you talk a little bit about, as an expert in the field of childcare and early education, how do you think that the research relates to childcare and childcare providers as a business as it relates to the study and the study findings?
Thank you for having me, and thank you for allowing me to share my thoughts and my experience. The study was very accurate. I prepared my responses and I sent it to Tony before I read the report. And I have to say that after I read the report, it mirrored everything I had. So it was a very good representation. I was appalled when I sat and I heard childcare can cost as much as $25,000. I thought 14 was high, but 25, it just took it over the top. And it just shows that childcare is an economic issue. In Fairfax, we have 17,000 providers. 95% of them are women. And when you look at the hourly rate that we earn across the board, it's like less than $5, but yet still the cost is so high. That in itself requires a study. Because from a child care provider standpoint, we don't see those dollars. We have requirements that we need to adhere to. We have regulatory requirements. People think, well, for your state license, you have 12 children and you're making, all this money. It should be. But, if you have 12 children, there's an age gap. And the gap is, for infants, that number of 12, because of the age gap in the point system, that means maximum you can have is 4 kids. And let's face it, providers are a part of the economy. This is your living. This is how you pay your rent. This is how you pay your mortgage. This is how you pay everything else. It is not a social services industry. But yet still, it is a business, and we are treated like a business. For example, there's a reason why it only goes up to age 64 for insurance, because at 64 you now are eligible for Medicare. And you no longer have to pay the $1,500 a month for health insurance if that's the way you go. And that's just one line item that we have to address. There are other line items that you have to address. I think just overall the expenses associated with being a provider is now being looked at. The subsidy program have done a lot. The federal grant has done a lot, but there's a lot more to be done in terms of quality. You should be able to take your child to one provider, and the next provider, you should be able to say you got quality care. That is not the case right now. It's not defined. It's not defined. The industry in itself, we're not treated as professionals, but yet still, we are building early learning foundations. What will that foundation look like if it does not have a good support system? And this foundation that I'm building needs to go into the school system, and the school system has a set of guidelines and benchmarks that I need to meet. How am I going to meet that? I meet that through my own initiative and through training and mentorship. Fairfax County is one of the counties that you can start a business in the childcare industry by filling out a form, and after that you have an introductory program that tells you about the business, and then there's a host of services that come complimentary to build you as a business to service your needs. If you factor that in itself, yes, it's free, but you have to get there. If you have children, you have to pay somebody to watch your kids while you get there. The pandemic taught us so much about childcare and the economic part of it that it needs to be addressed. The business of childcare is to support the economy. Why do we exist? We exist because women work, and those babies have to be someplace. They have to be kept safe, and they have to be educated. And that's the bottom line. There's a demand and there's a supply. And it needs to be, in the report, I think it was page 47 or 48, you talked about businesses. Businesses have to play a larger role. Today I heard you said about people, policy, and I wrote it down, business. We exist to support business, but we need to see the businesses stepping up. Businesses pay for machines. They maintain machines to keep those that are in the manufacturing, those that are in the service industry. We are service people. We need to be maintained. We need to be, it's not a government system where we're getting paid by the government to provide this service. We're business owners. But business owners don't make $4 an hour. And, from my viewpoint, as far as women and girls, there's so much. There's the Women's Business Center. I think of that support system that comes with Office for Children. It used to be Office for Children, excuse me. It's now the neighborhood. You probably know the new acronyms. But the services that the county has gone outside, has stepped out of its role as a county, and they've put in place a system, a foundation for childcare that needs to be built on. And that building on, they're doing it right now in the schools. They've got some programs. We talked about after-school programs. At age 14, I thought when I read it, I thought it was very coincidental that at age 14, the state requires, if you're going to have an assistant, they start at age 14. Well, it's perfect to have that opportunity as a training ground, to bring it in, and there's so many young girls. I go to George Mason every summer, and I say, okay, fine, I've got these kids coming, I need to have some support. And as I speak with you, 2 of them remained, and I was thrilled. But that's a void there, that the mentorship, what we do, you can learn on books, but it requires hand-on training. It requires, how do you nurture a child? What do you do? What are the first steps? Every aspect that I mentioned to you, there's a cost associated with it. And that cost historically has been carried on the backs of providers. I'm happy to report that we're getting some relief through some of these grants and all the federal programs, but there's a lot of work to be done. We need to talk to our elected officials. They need to come in and see what we do. They need to understand this is what we do, this is why we do it, and they need to give us the recognition that because of what I do, Tony can go to her job and have the peace of mind to perform at her peak, to generate the dollars to bring into that business. And those dollars need to filter back. It needs to circle back into the quality of life, not for the business people only, but for the whole community.
Absolutely. Thank you, Ms. Jackson. So, Rita, you have been hearing all of this. You've heard the research findings, you've read the executive summary, you've heard your other panel members talk about economics and health and child care. As you're listening to the conversation, speak a little bit about, as a future leader, as a current leader, actually, and a future leader, talk a little bit about what your insights are or your takeaways from this conversation today.
Yeah. I feel like as a leader in such a unique role, there are so many insights I could hit on. But today I just want to hit on like two main ones that I hope I'm able to articulate well enough for you all to understand, because I feel like they may sound like buzzwords at first, but they have a really deep meaning behind them, and they are approachability and vulnerability. Sometimes as leaders, we create unintentional barriers in terms of fear, whether that may be interacting with the people we lead or just the community in general. For example, as a leader, like when you first introduce yourself, you may say, oh, I'm president of X company, or I've founded this organization. And sometimes it's human nature to automatically think from like the other point of view, like, oh wow, this person must be so well put together, they're so successful, they must have like a lot of it figured out. But that's a big misconception, and that's not always necessarily the case. And those thoughts of somebody being so put together and so refined can like lead to fear in a way, and fear of talking to the person. Like you can get thoughts of, how do I converse with someone who's at such a high level if I have no similarity with them? And I think as leaders, something we can do to break that unintentional barrier is to just reapproach the situation in a different way. So instead of introducing yourself formally as like president of X company, you can introduce yourself through the love you have for the work. Talk about why you do what you do, and I think that helps in terms of breaking the fear of talking to a leader. And it definitely helps humanizes the situation. And I also feel like this ties in with my second key point, which is vulnerability. I know these are buzzwords and we hear them so much, but nobody truly is perfect, whether you're in a leadership title or you're not. Nobody has it all figured out. We all make mistakes, and we all have to ask each other for help. And I think a courageous leader and a brave leader is one who's comfortable asking for help, and one who's comfortable making mistakes in front of others, because that's what humanizes the situation, and that makes you more approachable, because there's that unintended barrier that's built at the beginning that, oh, this leader just knows it all and they have it figured out. But once you're able to be okay with being vulnerable and making mistakes in front of other people, that makes you more approachable. And I think the way this ties in with leadership is that this applies to anyone, not just women in leadership. And all leaders should be approachable and vulnerable in their own way. But for women specifically, I think that sometimes in the leadership field, we may be underrepresented. And so that's why it's important that we come together in unity and start breaking those barriers to build a bridge of, like, you don't have to be perfect to be a leader. You don't have to have it all figured out. And another point is just the way you formulate your thoughts is so important. Like sometimes when I introduce myself, I'll say like, oh, I'm the student representative on the Fairfax County School Board, and I represent 180,000 students. But what does that mean? You know, like what do I actually do? And so that's why it's so important that when you're communicating what you do in your role, you say why you love the work you do, or like why you're there for like whatever reason. Like instead I could say, oh, I work with the school board and I work with students to work against inequities we face. And it's so important, like even the small words, just saying like the inequities we face rather than like the inequities they face. Like it's so important to speak in union. It's like we and us versus they and the. It's not about the students, like we are the students. And so I think by just making those small changes and being more approachable and vulnerable, you're able to break the barrier of the fear that is unintentionally instilled at the beginning of any leadership journey. And from there, we're able to inspire young women throughout the world, really, and just show them that to be a leader, you don't have to be perfect and have it all figured out.
Thank you. Thank you, Britta, and thank you all of our panelists for that. We have some questions from the audience, and I'm hoping that I can read the writing, so bear with me. I think this first question is for UVA, and the question is, did parental leave come up in community conversations. For example, dad staying home to take care of the children.
I'm trying to think. Tony, you might be able to answer this one as well as either of us. I don't remember exactly. I mean, for sure, I think Jamie spoke to it too. I think a lot of these, I mean, there's just so many different facets of, the support that's required in the childcare context, flexible work hours, reduced work hours, parental leave. I don't know if it was, and if one of you guys remember a really good nugget, stop me. But I think more so than anything, people more spoke about these kinds of supports, in together as one.
Yeah, I didn't hear specifically around parental leave. In the community conversations, there were themes around women really trying to make sure that they are balancing the duties of the household a little bit more and asking their partners to be a part of that, as opposed to feeling like they needed to do it all. And so there were some insights and conversations around, letting partners and spouses and others in the household to help, and to requiring that sort of as a balance. So I did hear that, but not specifically around parental leave.
So I'll add to that. I think we had two community conversations going on one evening at the same time or in parallel. And we did hear a little bit about the flexibility, especially in the first year of having children, that it was really soon to have to go back to work, whether it was 6 weeks or 12 weeks or whatever that time frame was. And definitely remote work is important for women at all ages of children, but that first year we heard that they needed more flexibility in being able to work fewer days in the office or being able to, continue nursing their children past that time frame. And so that was really important to them. So I think it goes back to that flexibility. But I think echoing what Jamie said as well, just from a personal perspective, I found that when my daughters hit high school, they needed maybe more care. And fortunately, I had a husband who had a very flexible job and would, on a moment's notice, could drop and go pick them up. But not everybody, again, has that luxury. So it takes all kinds and all types of policy.
It is interesting that as your children go through various stages, the level of care that they need, and it's just not when they're infants. It's almost more, as you said, when they get older. But anecdotally, we've seen more men become candidates since the pandemic, and we've had quite a few men who are stay-at-home dads that are looking to get back into the workforce in some form or fashion. I don't have any, data-driven, to tell you more than just anecdotally that we've placed more men in the number of candidates in our applicant pool that are men has grown since the pandemic.
Great, thank you. So I wanted to add one more thing to that conversation. I have a friend actually here in the audience who said to me she worked her entire career until her children hit teenage, and that's when she became a stay-at-home mom. So absolutely, that's an important insight. So I think this question is for any of the panelists, and so let me just read it. It says, the study identified many needs about wages and childcare. It seems easier to influence and implement changes in the private sector. How do you see such changes, wage review, for example, by external entities, telework flexibility for Fairfax County government employees when their pay comes from local taxes? And so how do you sort of implement this flexibility across Fairfax County? Some insights about that, and that any of the panelists can sort of speak to that question.
Happy to take the first go at it. Some of the practices that we use at my company, transparent pay, right? I think the state of California was one of the first to require employers to disclose what the range for a salary for a role is before applying. And then a second thing that I've seen that we've also implemented is no negotiation on pay. Because what that does is that it gives folks that have more experience negotiating, folks that are a little bit ballsier, the ability to negotiate higher rates. Whereas if you walk into the conversation and say, this is the budget that we have for this particular role, and this is how much you'd get paid on as far as the range goes, we don't negotiate. It gives the person the ability to say, yes, I opt in, or no, I'm going to look for another opportunity. So those are, I think, two quick ways to be able to just level the playing field so that it really doesn't matter who the person is. They have the ability to get an equal or an equitable pay rate for the role.
Thank you. Others want to respond at all? Okay, let's move on. This question is, it was important to learn the benefits provided by multi-generational households. I think this is for UVA. Did the data or community conversations identify any other relationships or institutions in the community that impact success of women and girls currently?
I do think that the Fairfax County Opportunity Program seemed to have success in supporting women and in embracing their, where we saw women volunteering was around issues in their community that were a result of their coming together and being able to say, as part of that program, I think they have to define what actions they want taken. And so that empowered them to also realize they needed to become active in that as well, and taught them to do that. So I thought that was important. And through those conversations, we did see the role for having, and I know I said this already, but places for women to come together so they can have these conversations and just be able to talk. That reduced their isolation and I think just helped them be happier or more proactive, knowing that they had this kind of support network, whether it was just being able to collaborate or talk, or in one neighborhood we heard about the one woman who had a limousine service and she said she was the Uber service for the neighborhood. She was, so there were support networks, but it was subtle throughout as well. So Joanna?
Yeah, I think one thing that I sort of felt bubbled up from the community conversations overall was this like communal craving. Mm-hmm. I'll call it to be buzzwordy. But yeah, I think one thing that was interesting throughout, looking at the data and then having these conversations, just having like so much information to cull through and like pull out the themes. I think the idea of multi-generational households sort of represents something bigger, which is, of course, as people have discussed, there's often caregiving role that comes with multi-generational living, but a lot of families opt for that style because of the communal support, but many people in the conversations pointed out how they achieved that communal support in other ways, like the opportunity neighborhoods that you mentioned, and then also I think we had several groups where the women just in the room celebrated each other for helping them, just participating, like sitting side by side in the day, having someone to talk to. All of those things were so important to the people we spoke to. And on top of that, many people also mentioned almost a vision of a more communal living style. We had one group that spoke about, different household configurations where we have the child care and then the senior living all together, and how I think there was just sort of this craving for unique and a community really where it's not just it's an intentional supportive network. I think that came through definitely in the conversations.
Thank you. And Joanna, while you have the mic and you've pushed the mic on button, there were several questions around clarification in the categorization of race and ethnicity. There were a couple of questions about was the category described as Black being separated into American-born versus foreign-born. I'll ask all of these together so I know that you can talk a little bit about kind of the challenges with data collection. Again, I know you mentioned it in your presentation as well. And then there was a question around Hispanic and Middle Eastern cultures often check the box, identifying as white, and was this taken into consideration when you looked at comparisons? And then what's the distinction of women of color, and when you were categorizing that in some of the research? So these were all kind of questions for clarification around how particular categories were developed in your research. So can you speak a little bit to that?
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's a great question. I think coming from, a data brain, you see a label and you're like, what's the data behind that label? Like, what do people, exactly the question, what do you check to get in that category? And I think too, when we were putting together the report, the question we were asking ourselves was, how does somebody see themselves in the data? Because often it's hard to see yourself in data. And I think that's another reason why the community conversations were so important. But to answer some of the questions concretely, women of color, when they're mentioned in the report, are any of those identities that aren't white women. So that would be any women of any race other than white, and then also Hispanic women. And to talk a little bit more about the limitations of the available data on race and ethnicity, this was something that we really were battling with throughout the report. This question about, all of us, we have the experience of filling out a survey, whether that's, you can actually remember if you filled out the census, what you checked for yourself, or if it's really any other survey. It can be really difficult. And you're absolutely right. The ideas that were said in the question of, different people, whoever they are, Hispanics in particular, also Asian Americans, you have a different conception of yourself than what is put in a racial tick box. So there's nothing in the report that we really do to get around that except to acknowledge it at the beginning. And I think we just have to frame every takeaway knowing that this data is really imperfect for that reason. And I think that's the big motivation at the end to call for new ideas around data collection about these things. Going through the report, one of the things that I was most struck by was this other racial category, which I had never really given much thought to. But if you don't mark one of the ones that they have, one of the races they have a checkbox for on the census, they put you in an other racial category. And we were seeing over and over again these measures where women of other races were the most vulnerable, the most impacted. And so it's sort of like, well, what does that mean? Like, what do you do with that? And I think the only thing we can do with something like that is recognize that, we need more data collection around these things. And on top of that, too, looking at other intersections to get at those ideas as well. So for the other racial category, many of those women are foreign-born women who are marking themselves as other, or they're just not falling in one of those other categories. So I think, I also have a lot of thoughts about this question, so you're welcome to, I would love to answer anything more later. But yeah, I think that overall, this is a great opportunity for just really being more specific with our data collection to get at, some of those most vulnerable populations and really have data that better reflects how people actually identify.
Absolutely, and we know from the study that there were identities and experiences that were not included because we did not have data to be able to do that. So that acknowledgement is really, really important. I appreciate you making that clarification. Thank you. This is for Salima and Melanie. You both decided to leave corporations to start your own business. And a question from the audience is, what factors went into that decision specifically as it relates to being a woman and or having family obligations?
I love that question. So whoever asked that question, you're my favorite person, because I really do. And I wish I could say it was because, I wanted more flexibility, or, I thought that, I had reasons beyond myself. But it was really, as an immigrant woman, as a minority woman, to be very transparent, I knew that I was going to hit a glass ceiling in those jobs, that it would be much harder to achieve my ambitions while I was in that setting. I felt I could do much more, starting my own business, carving my own path, and doing it in a way that was on my terms. So that was the primary reason. And I was lucky that I had the support from my family. I have a husband who has a very flexible job, right? So he can provide that support to me to be able to take that path. So that was my reason.
Very similar reason over here. There was a lot that I couldn't understand about corporate America that I wrestled with as a woman in tech, coming up pretty quickly. I went through a rotational program and very quickly became a senior technical product manager, and I saw the glass ceiling. I saw it staring at me directly in my face. The VP of our team, who was a phenomenal woman leader, was ousted in a way that was not very ceremonious. And then, comparing the work that I knew was above and beyond the person that had previously held my role, a male that identified with the manager of the team, seeing the different ways we were treated, the micromanaging that all of a sudden happened, things like that made it very clear to me that I was either going to continue to bang my head against a brick wall or I needed to find a way to forge my own path and to have a little bit more control over my destiny. So that was the reason I got into it. And then what's kept me here are for very similar reasons. My company is all about supporting business development with a cultural lens within it, right? We're talking about women and girls, but if you think about all the different aspects of entrepreneurship, when it comes to women, when it comes to race, when it comes to all of these various identities, there are challenges that are faced, again, if you look at it juxtaposed to the standard, which is the white male. There's so many disparities when it comes to funding. Salima mentioned this earlier. Funding, support, resources, all of that, access to networks, these secret underground organizations that I'm realizing exist. And so the work that I do is all about how do we bring those groups that don't necessarily know or have the access to these opportunities to help them be able to grow and scale and eventually become IPO'd companies and eventually, hit the NASDAQ and things like that. So that's the reason I made that transition and the work that I believe is so important.
I just want to add one thing, Tony, just to go, connect to what Melanie mentioned. The thing that keeps me in business is because there are not a lot of business owners who look like me and Melanie. And we need to do it for future generations. So we have to do it, and we have to continue this path because we need to see more business owners like us.
Absolutely. I'm getting my little thing here. Okay, so I'm going to ask Jamie a question really quickly. We only have 5 minutes. Hunter, and then Rita, if you can just close us out, that would be awesome. Jamie, the question for you is, what strategies do you think are important in terms of creating opportunities for women to enter or re-enter the workforce, and particularly for persons who are historically marginalized, such as women of color, immigrant women, or women with disabilities? Are there some specific strategies that you think could be helpful?
I don't want to keep using this word, but I think flexibility is incredibly helpful, is going to be incredibly helpful for helping all women. But I think, we talk a lot about, and Melanie, not to knock it, but AI. I think not using AI in terms of, and again, I'm speaking more from the employer side, but looking at skills as opposed to when we're looking at resumes, and not using AI, but skill development, I think is really important. There's going to be a huge talent shortage coming up, and if we're not looking at skill development, so how can we support women of all varieties, but of marginalized community in skill development? And maybe that's not what they did before, but what are their skills, and how can we help them re-enter the workforce in a meaningful manner, using the skills that they have now?
Thank you. And Hunter, one of the findings was about access to a car and availability as a component to preventive health care. Can you speak a little bit about those as challenges, and does this ring true with your experience?
I mean, it's a real thing. There's no question about that. I mean, I have a car, and I'm a year overdue for my mammogram. No judgment. Because I just can't find the time to get that done. Imagine if I had to take 2 buses and then walk a half a mile to get to my provider, right? And so, yes, we are regularly seeing that when we call people to follow up on missed appointments and things like that, one of the main reasons is I didn't have a car, I didn't have a way to get there. We also see a lot of, I had childcare issues, just as a side note, because we are seeing that as a thing. But so yes, and there's been some efforts to sort of address that. Like, there is Medicaid transportation. It's not particularly reliable, it's time consuming, and for whatever reason, our families have a real resistance to it. Many of them don't have credit cards, so an Uber account is off the table. You know what I mean? And so a lot of our Hispanic families in particular are using raiteros, which are off-the-book Ubers. But, so it's a guy in the community who's willing to pick you up and drive you wherever you need to go. But he charges 2 to 3 times what an Uber costs, so that's cost prohibitive. So I think it's an area where we're looking at how we can, do we do a bus? Do we do transportation? Do we offer clinics in the communities and in the schools? I think everything is on the table right now because transportation is assuredly impacting their ability to get to their appointments. So,
Thank you. And then Rita, close us out in the last moment before we have our closing remarks on what is going well as you're seeing with girls in Fairfax County Public Schools. What's that bright spot that you're seeing?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I feel like as students, we're able to connect with each other so well, especially like just being with Gen Z, we're able to really feel each other on a different level. At my school, I'm a part of an IT girls club where it's just girls and women in STEM, and the different connections we're able to make, whether that may be through classes we're taking or just different scenarios we experience as girls in an underrepresented and a male-dominated field. It's really comforting to be able to understand that you're not like alone in that. And I think outside of women, like students today are just able to feel not alone because we're so well connected, whether that may be like through social media or just in general. There's a really good avenue of communication I feel like our generation has built. And so in terms of what is going well, I feel like it's just communication and being able to connect with each other on a very authentic level. But yeah.
Thank you. Can we thank our panelists? Thank you all. Thank you so much. And so I'm going to ask our panelists to stay, and we're going to invite our chair for the Commission for Women to provide us with closing remarks. Felicia Woods is coming down. She's going to close us out and tell us what the next steps are. Thank you, Felicia, for being here.
No problem. Thanks, Tony. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Felicia Woods, the chair of the Fairfax County Commission for Women. This report was power-packed with a lot of information, and, it's truly a call to action for all of us. While we were sitting here listening, I was reflecting on my own mom and her journey to get me to where I am today and how she balanced work and life through many challenges. She was a full-time mom, a full-time employee, a part-time student, and a full-time caregiver. And to do all of that, I'm pretty sure she could have used some of the resources that we have in Fairfax County back when I was a child and trying to help raise and steer my brother and I. So it's only fitting that we have a report like this being issued during Women's History Month. And this is a report that was really completed to show and help us frame our policies for the future. And I only hope that as we continue in Fairfax County, we can reflect on some of the gains that are here, some of the goals that are here, and truly address some of the gaps that are here. So for 53 years, the Commission for Women has been a voice for women and girls in Fairfax County. And our mission is truly to improve the status of women and girls in all aspects of their lives. And over those years, CFW has celebrated numerous accomplishments, including successfully installing the Turning Point Suffrages Memorial in Lorton, Virginia. We've also really focused on building and making equality when it comes to baseball and softball fields for girls in the school system here. And lastly, as a result of the pandemic, we issued our own report that examined the toll that the pandemic took on women in the workforce. And CFW's COVID-19 report illuminated the impact on women and underscored many of the findings that are present here in the Gains, Gaps, and Goals report. So, for example, women were overwhelmed by the need for more affordable, reliable childcare, and also more assistance with caregiving and just simply managing care within the homes. So that's why the Commission was very grateful to partner with all of the people here that are represented on the stage and out in the audience, in particular UVA. We also held our own conversation within the commissioners to come and talk about the issues that we're facing, being commissioners but also living within Fairfax County. And we hope to continue this partnership as recommendations are implemented. You know, the only way that we can close gaps while elevating gains is through partnership and alignment. So one event, one discussion, and one interaction is not enough to create change. And today marks the beginning of CFW's discussions around this report and getting to the granular level of how we can start implementing many of these recommendations. So we are ready to go deep with our partners to truly focus on next steps. So I invite you to join us for another conversation. And this is something that CFW is putting on May 17th here at the Government Center, where we're going to go deeper into the recommendations about health and how health truly influences your economic status and also influences your work-life balance. I think one of the panelists just spoke about transportation and how you need transportation to get to a doctor, but you also need transportation to get to work. And if you're not healthy enough to get to work, then that influences your economic status and also your work-life balance. So knowing this, we are compelled to focus in particular on health again. So join us here on May 17th at 1:30 p.m. to discuss Health Matters, and it's going to be a spotlight on health of women and girls in Fairfax County. So we're excited to keep this conversation active. And in closing, a more actionable thing that you can do throughout Women's History Month, we've been collecting donations of feminine supplies to really help with the menstrual gap that's occurring in our county. So there are drop-off locations here at the Government Center and also at all of Fairfax County's libraries that we're looking for unopened boxes of tampons, pads, liners, and brand new menstrual cups. So if you're willing to help the women and girls in this county, please donate. And last but not least, I just want to thank you all for coming on a Friday, and we invite you to join us in the atrium for a reception. So I will not keep you any longer from the food and the drinks. So thank you again, and also we'll take a photo outside too. Thanks.
This concludes our program.